Look at the series we've ended with David. I want to take a few minutes this morning to talk about choices that people will make. And at the following part of the sermon, you will see some choices that 6 within our congregation are actually going to be making. When you think about it, choices are really a significant part of our life. Some choices are rather simple. What am I going to eat for breakfast? Unless you go to the grocery store and see 500 different types of cereal. Then you've got to figure out which one am I going to choose. Other choices are going to be rather complex, and a little more thought is going to be required. Some are thinking about, whom shall I marry? You want to give that one some thought before you make a choice. Others are thinking about, what will I do for my career? In generations gone by, my grandfather worked for only one company for about 40 or 50 years. The younger generation today will have possibly between 5 and 7 different careers. So choices will become much more frequent. And then there are some choices which are just absolutely foolish, at least in my opinion. And I read one of them this morning. A man was bored stiff, but he noticed that the dog and the cat seemed to be very content. And he wondered, how could I become content? And so he made a decision that he would live like a goat for 6 days. Can you imagine that? Living like a goat. He had prostheses made so he could walk and act like a goat. He even ate grass, found it rather hard to digest, and had to boil it later on. But he made friends, especially with one goat who seemed to be rather fond of him as he lived in the pasture for 1 week. Now, if you think I'm making that up, read the Toronto Star this morning. The story is in there. So we make lots of choices. Some are simple, some are complex, some are absolutely crazy. Joshua asked the people to make a critical choice. And this was the question he asked them. Will you serve the Lord your God? Isn't that an interesting question? Will you serve the Lord your God? I think that's a question we all need to think about in our own life. Because that question is so important because it will affect the very way we live in this present moment of time. But it will also have an impact on the rest of our life for all of eternity. Will I choose to follow the Lord or not? It's either one or the other. There is no sitting on the middle of the fence. And so that was the question that he actually asked. And so in asking that question, we need to go back a bit, something has jumped. We need to ask this question, will I serve the Lord God myself? Now for 400 years, the nation of Israel had been in bondage. They cried out to God, and as you know, God sent them a rescuer in the person of Moses. And he led them for 40 years across the wilderness to the edge of the promised land. In that 40-year journey, he had a young man whom he mentored. And that young man's name was Caleb. And though Joshua never entered, or rather as Moses never entered into the promised land, Caleb was his partner, Joshua was the young man who was given the leadership responsibility for the nation of Israel, and he led them into the promised land and got the nation settled. All of these times, he had served his generation well. He had looked after the people. He watched out for them. He was concerned about their needs. But now he is an old man, and he knows that his time here on earth is very limited. And so what he is doing is he is preparing to die. But even though he is preparing for death, he looks to the future. He doesn't just look back and reminisce, as wonderful as that can be. He looks to the future as to what is ahead. Because he wants to know how his people will be cared for. And he knows that there will be challenges that not only the next generation, but the generation after will have to face. So some of us here have lived longer than others. We've seen a lot of our children here. They're the up-and-coming generation. We ask this question, how will they do? How will they fare? What will be life like for them? Are we preparing them to live out each day? And Joshua knew that the generation that he had served would face a temptation. And the temptation would be that they would actually abandon God. But what is his desire? His desire is that they remain faithful to the Lord. The PowerPoint's not going to work. We're in the process of getting a new computer, so don't worry about it. So he makes this statement. He gathers these people together, and this is what he says. Fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Then he says this. If serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose this day whom you will serve. So you got a choice. Do you want to serve God? If you choose not to, then that is your choice. But decide which way you're going to go. But then he adds this statement. But as for me and my family, we have made a decision. And our decision is we will serve the Lord. Now, as Joshua is making this as part of his farewell speech, because he knows he is dying, he knows that this will be a decision that people continually need to make. He knows that around them will be all kinds of different nations, and these nations worship and serve other gods. And he does know this, that culture can influence people. And he also knows part of the human heart, that we want to fit in. We don't want to be oddballs. We don't want to be described as being weird or different. Some people don't even want to rock the boat. But Joshua said, you have to make a choice. Well, who are you going to follow? And he said, I have made a choice, and my family has made a choice. And our choice is, we want to serve the Lord. Now, it's interesting, in the original text, the way it is expressed is a little bit different. And the literal translation would be this. We have chosen to serve the Lord, and we will continue to choose to serve the Lord. So he knows that this is going to be a decision that he has to make day after day after day. Because every day is a new day. And what are we going to do? So sometimes people might think, well, that's fine, Joshua, you're the leader, you're expected to say all kinds of really significant words in people's lives. But is this a reality in your life? So some people might say, like, I'm a committed follower of Jesus. But how do they know? Is there any evidence that that is a reality? So when Joshua made that statement, he saw that reality in his own life. Moses, when he was leading the people of Israel, was called by God to go up to the mountain, and God was going to speak to him. And that's where he received the 10 Commandments from God. But Moses was gone a long time, and the people at the bottom, at the camp, got really upset, and they said, maybe God has abandoned us. Maybe Moses has deserted us. We need a God that we can worship and see. And they convinced Aaron, the brother of Moses, to gather gold, and they melted it down, and they shaped it into the form of a calf. And the people started to bow down and worship this golden calf. Look at the influence. This is what the cultures around them did. They had all kinds of foreign gods. People did not want to be different, so if my neighbor was handing in gold, I guess I better hand in mine so we can be a part of this. Except Joshua never did it. He refused to identify with these people who were abandoning their relationship with God. And as they were about to enter into the promised land, they didn't know what the land would be like, and Moses said, we're going to send in 10 men who will act as spies, and we're going to check out the land and see what it's like. And they came back and they said, the land is lush. There are grapes and figs, and there is plenty to eat, and the cities are amazing. But, there's always a but, isn't there? the inhabitants are like giants, and we look like grasshoppers. You know what a giant does to a grasshopper? And they were terrified. And they all said to Moses, we can't go in and take that land except for 2 men, Joshua and Caleb. And they said, God has promised us this. We want to follow God. We will serve him with our whole heart. He refused to give in to the majority report because he believed in the promises of God. He chose not to listen to the fears of the people. He said, in serving God, I will trust him completely with my whole life. Now that speech that he gave is not simply a form of inspiring rhetoric, but it was a deep reality in his life because he lived in that relationship with God day by day. And he knew that to be a follower of God requires continuous choices every single day. So the people heard all this, and they made a choice. And this is what the people said. Far be it from us to forsake the Lord to serve other gods. It was the Lord who brought us out of Egypt. They remembered that. He has protected us on our entire journey. And we too will serve the Lord because he is our God. Now here's the question. Were they sincere? Or was it just rhetoric? In the past, they had followed other gods. Perhaps some of them felt, I've got the strength and ability within myself just to overcome anything that happens, and so I can do it on my own. Instead of saying, God, I need to have this living, dynamic relationship with you day by day where I will trust you to make the decisions that are correct and honoring and pleasing to you this day. And so, Joshua speaks to them. He is delighted that they said, we too want to serve the Lord, but he said, let me give you a warning. A warning. And this is what he said. If you forsake the Lord, he will turn from you, even after he has been good to you. If you forsake God, he's saying, you're on your own. You make the very best of life as you can because you have left me out. And the people were aware of the choice. They understood the warning, and they said, no, our desire is to serve God. So Joshua wants to underscore their choice by making a covenant. And a covenant is like an agreement. It's a promise that people make. And he said, what we're going to do is that you're going to make this statement, but we're going to put a big stone. And every time you see that stone, it is a reminder that you have made a covenant, that you have made a promise to Almighty God that you will serve him. You know, a lot of you here have made a covenant. If you look on your hand, you will see a ring if you're married. You know, I've done a wedding or two in my days, and I've heard people say things. And I ask them, are you going to make vows to each other? And they talk about vows. And here are some of the traditional ones. I promise to love you, be committed to you in sickness and health, whether we're rich or poor. Prefer rich? No, they don't used to say that. Rich or poor, in sickness or in health, until we are separated by death. And now to you and to God, I make this solemn vow and promise. Any of you ever said something similar to that? You don't have to raise your hand. And then we say, I would like to make this covenant sealed. And we give rings. And in the giving of the rings, people will say, I give you this ring as a symbol and pledge of the promises made between us. So when you look at this ring, it's not just simply saying, I'm married. It's saying, I have made a covenant with another person in a way that I have made a covenant with no one else. No one else. And so he has this marker placed, this huge stone. And that stone was to be a reminder to them and to the upcoming generations. Because the upcoming generations must also choose, whom are we going to serve? And we know, as we read biblical history, the following generations did not always choose well. And some of them left God out, and it resulted in confusion, it resulted in lawlessness, and in deep sorrow. There were consequences to abandoning their covenant with God. And so today we live in what's called the post-Christian, postmodern era, where many people are raised with what we call no Christian memory. They don't know the story of God because they were never taught by the previous generation. Many people vote today, and right becomes based upon 51% of the popular vote, or whatever is the latest trend according to the culture. But what is the foundation for making these decisions? You see, if we don't have a solid foundation, we will cave in and give in to the culture. Here's what Jesus says: I invite you to come and follow me. And so you might make that decision. I'd like to follow Jesus, but the choice does not end there. The choice is, I will continually choose to walk in obedience to Christ. And that's why Jesus said, if you love me, the evidence of that is that you are following me by obeying my commandments and my teaching. You know what the Apostle Paul said? He said, I am a bond slave of Christ. Now in Rome, where that term was used, a bond slave did whatever the master asked. And Paul said, that's my choice in following Jesus. I want to do whatever he asks. And Paul is simply saying, Lord, here is my life. I'm yours forever. Forever. So this morning, some of our brothers and sisters will stand before you in the next few moments, and they will declare that they are committed to following Jesus and that they have made this as their choice. And there will be a sign of the covenant, and the sign is baptism. And baptism is an outward sign of an inward reality of God's grace and love. And as people will think back, they will think back to their baptism and be reminded of the work of God's grace and his commitment to them and their commitment to him. And so in our tradition, in the Presbyterian Church and in the Reformed tradition, we have the baptism of children, of infants, which is the baptism of promise. It looks forward. And one of our candidates this morning was baptized as a young person. She will be professing her faith, saying, Lord, I am claiming that as a reality in my own life. As an infant, she did not have a voice, but her mom and dad raised her within the faith, and God, by his grace, has worked in her life to bring her to this place where today she will stand before all of us and make that declaration. Others are adults, and they have come to faith, perhaps later in life. And they are going to, on their own profession, declare Jesus is Lord and desire to follow him. Within our tradition, we believe that the sacrament of baptism, it is not significant what method we use, but it's the meaning of baptism. It means that our sins have been washed away, that we are united with Christ, that we have died to an old way of living, and we want to live before the face of God. And so some candidates will be sprinkled, and others will be immersed. Within our tradition, we do all three. Some of you thought, I didn't know there was a third. Well, the third is pouring, because it is not the way we baptize, it is the meaning of baptism, whereby people are saying, this is the sign of the covenant. And what they are saying to us this morning will be this: I have made a choice, and I have chosen to follow the Lord, and by God's grace, I will continue to follow him day after day after day until God calls me home. We're going to pray, then we're going to sing, and the children will be coming back in, and we're going to ask them to sit with their families, because we want them to be part of this witness that we are going to be sharing in the next few moments.